Federal environmental enforcement here in EPA Region 2. So, if you look at environmental rules of any kind, they're going to be useless without an enforcement program. The United States Environmental Protection Agency has a strong enforcement program. EPA Region 2 covers New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and the United States Virgin Islands. And it's committed to a strong federal enforcement presence. From year to year, the number of enforcement actions that the EPA works on may change a lot, but the trend over time shows big increases in federal enforcement. EPA and Region 2 are more careful and refined in selecting enforcement targets. This is the enforcement thinking that EPA has developed over the past 40 years of environmental enforcement, and how that thinking has been implemented here in Region 2. Several basic observations explain the EPA's enforcement thinking. Compliance with environmental rules is often really expensive. It's costly, sometimes extremely so. And these investments that are required usually don't enhance the profits of affected industry. Businesses don't really voluntarily elect to comply with environmental rules without really good reasons. Widespread voluntary compliance by business is important if environmental programs are going to end up working. And the number of pollution sources that are subject to rules are larger than the government's ability to oversight. EPA can't have an environmental cop on every single corner, so EPA has to let business police itself. The government's enforcement strategy has to create a climate where the natural profit-driven reasons drive business that businesses don't want to comply with expensive reasons gets overcome with their need to comply. So having a wide voluntary compliance system will happen when the regulated community ends up being aware of the rules that apply to it, think that there's a decent chance that environmental violations are going to be found, and believe that if a violation is found, it's likely that strong sanctions, like big cash penalties, are going to be imposed. At the same time, an enforcement strategy has to respond to the biggest violations based on how bad their environmental impact is, or the impact that they have on the environmental rule integrity. EPA decided that to have the best chance of achieving these ambitious goals, a good enforcement strategy has to deal with 5 different points of the enforcement process. Looking at finding affected facilities, educating facility operators and giving compliance assistance, going out and monitoring environmental compliance, selecting and carrying out a timely and appropriate enforcement response when violations are finally found, and then following up with companies to make sure that future compliance is met by former violators. EPA's enforcement strategy has to also encourage regulated companies to do self-policing that EPA sees as important for the overall success of an environmental program. When you go out and you try to find affected facilities, the first step in a strong enforcement strategy is to develop a complete inventory of facilities that are subject to each rule, with a way to find and add additional facilities. For some environmental programs, this is pretty easy. By establishing inventory of automobile manufacturers that have to meet specific car emission standards, or an inventory of petroleum refineries that might be subject to a gasoline lead level restriction. In both of those examples, there are just a few regulated facilities that you have to look at. They're easy to find. But for other programs, developing a comprehensive inventory gets super hard. For example, like an inventory of every site in the country where hazardous wastes have been deposited, or an inventory of every single piece of equipment that has polychlorinated biphenyls, it's kind of hard to make a comprehensive inventory. So the strategy then has to be, at least, you've got to give a way to continually find likely candidates. For hazardous waste sites, EPA is always looking for information about possible sites from a lot of different sources, like state and local government agencies, news media, citizens, and so on. The inventory is always growing and it's not going to be complete. But if the information gathering effort is well designed and implemented, we can guess that most sites, and maybe the worst sites, have or will be identified. Ideally, an inventory has to have as much information as possible about the pollution source, like the chemical composition, the quantity and rate of emissions, height of smokestacks, location of discharge pipes for pollution, the character of waters that get discharges and wastes, the plant operating capacity and usual operating rates, things like that. More information helps build a better compliance monitoring strategy. If we have refined electronic national databases, it gives you an ability to efficiently store and recover the information, which gets used in compiling and updating the inventory of sources. as well as other parts of the enforcement program. Now, if you want to look at educating companies, you've got to teach the regulated community and give good compliance assistance. It's a basic part of law that ignorance of the law is no defense. But still, when the success of an environmental rule program depends a lot on voluntary compliance, a strong effort to educate the regulated community is really worthwhile. Once an environmental inventory of facilities is put together, information packages can be sent to affected facilities. Classes where government staff can explain the requirements can be held, and the news media like newspapers, trade press for an affected facility can be used in an outreach effort. Where extensive environmental rules began in the 1970s, the focus was often on major utility manufacturing facilities that put out a whole lot of pollution. As those big facilities came into compliance, the remaining pollution from smaller facilities became more important. Because these smaller facilities, usually operated by small businesses, they've been increasingly subjected to rule requirements. These small businesses lack the expertise and resources that are available to larger companies and corporations that are required to understand and properly respond to complicated environmental issues. In response to the changing universe of regulated companies, EPA has increased its efforts at providing compliance assistance, usually and mainly focusing on small businesses. One example of small businesses is a dry cleaner. These are common in cities and urban areas, and they're regulated because of the hazardous solvents that are used in dry cleaning. Region 2 has undertaken big efforts at informing dry cleaning establishments about these rules and trying to help them comply. In New York City, Korean immigrants own a lot of dry cleaners, so EPA wrote informational brochures in Korean as well as English. Printing companies are another part of operations that have become regulated, primarily due to the use of solvents in inks and for their cleaning equipment in recent years. Though some printers are large businesses, many are small and find it difficult to comply with rules. EPA has developed outreach programs for the printing industry and has worked to establish special environmental resource centers for printers. In the past, EPA would usually give suggestions to companies on how to come into compliance, but this advice was usually given in pieces when an occasion popped up. Now, over the past couple of years, EPA has begun to build more detailed programs that give industry-specific and even site-specific technical advice for compliance. And EPA is making use of the email and the internet. Agency-wide and regional internet sites give a lot of compliance assistance information for a lot of different industrial sectors. EPA's virtual compliance assistance centers for several different industries can be accessed online, and they usually get a lot of hits every year. Out here in Region 2, a reorganization in the mid-1990s resulted in the creation of a separate compliance assistance unit. Technical staff resources were shifted into this function for more traditional hard enforcement activities. If you look at compliance inspections and enforcement case support, those are hard. If you look at compliance monitoring, there are a lot of ways of finding out the compliance status of affected facilities. And all the facilities that are available should be incorporated into the enforcement strategy. Direct inspections and testing by government employees is usually the best, but it's among the most expensive ways of finding compliance. There are other ways of finding out compliance, like routine self-reporting. Industries can be required to regularly monitor their own emissions and discharges and then report these on a yearly basis to the government. The best known example of these types of programs is a requirement that all people that have a National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit have to file what's called a periodic discharge monitoring report with the federal or state government. A big part of all water pollution enforcement cases are based on information that gets reported in these discharge monitoring reports. Under the Clean Air Act, there were amendments in the 1990, and there were following rule changes, and this affected the many types of facilities that now have to install continuous emission monitors that keep track of what's coming out of smokestacks. These companies have to report this data from these continuous monitors, and they have to report it in a similar way to this National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. It's similar to the discharge monitoring reports. Now, if you have a failure to monitor, or if you report inaccurate information, these are compliance problems that are subject to the overall enforcement strategy. If penalties for false reporting are really strong, and if the risk of finding non-reporters is real, then self-reporting becomes an effective compliance monitoring tool. A self-reporting program has to be combined with a program of field audits by government employees and inspectors. Now, when we look at targeted information gathering, this is instead of the routine self-monitoring program. EPA can require a business to carry out special self-testing or to report other relevant information. EPA can ask for operating logs and financial records that show when pollution control equipment was purchased, when it was installed, say how much and what type of fuel was used, and what materials were used. In most federal enforcement environmental laws, Congress has granted EPA broad information gathering power. That can be used whenever non-compliance is suspected. Increasingly, in an effort to get the most accurate information and to reduce arguments about the facts, an enforcement case isn't usually started until after an enforcement information letter has first been sent. Citizen tips are also helpful. Tips from citizens that live near a facility or even people who work in a facility can be very helpful in finding possible violators. The likelihood of receiving such tips grows when the government publicizes the existence of an environmental rule and makes available telephone or online hotlines for anonymous calls. Some federal enforcement rules also give legal job protection for whistleblowers. These are employees who report problems from employees and employers. Now we have remote sensing. In today's high-tech age, there's a range of technology that's available that can stretch EPA's limited inspection resources. For example, aerial and online photography, geophysical satellite data, GIS data, can find potential hazardous waste sites through the presence of distressed vegetation. An aerial photo history can show staff the history of a facility over time, and it can find the illegal filling of wetlands or unauthorized landfills. Infrared photography shows clues of the location of industrial discharges, like thermal discharges of wastewater into waterways. EPA even developed a mobile laser beam system for precise measurement of opacity or the density of smoke plumes at night. Now you have self-policing. EPA has several policies that are intended to regulate companies and allow them to report their own violations. Now, this can be part of the mitigation of penalties that encourage self-policing, even including that the core of any compliance monitoring requirement will be government inspections in the field. Smart enforcement, when linked with limited inspection resources, is very important. When you target inspections, EPA uses a lot of different targeting techniques. For most programs, EPA defines certain resources in the inventory as major or significant sources based on the actual or total volume of pollutant discharges. The enforcement strategy, even the underlying rules, can require a minimum number of inspections, like once a year, for all of these big sources. Emission sources may also be targeted based on the environmental quality of the ecosystem where their pollution is released. Air pollution sources in an area which don't meet the minimum public health related ambient air quality standards that are established by EPA are given a higher priority for inspections than for facilities that are in attainment areas with cleaner air. Water pollution sources that discharge into a surface drinking water supply or hazardous waste landfills that leak into underground groundwater have a higher priority. In some programs, where it's harder to predict and find out the environmental impacts of a specific facility or a possible violation, or where the impact of any violation is really serious, well, those inspections might be scheduled on a really random basis from among all sources in the inventory. Some inspections are also announced to the facility in advance, and some are unannounced. Announced inspections are really satisfactory, where possible violations can't